British expert, Trump made a mistake by pushing Ukraine peace talks too early. On March 30th, British political analyst Alexander Mercuri stated that US President Donald Trump made a strategic mistake by initiating peace talks on Ukraine before Russian forces achieved a decisive breakthrough on the battlefield. According to Mercuri's, a true crisis needs to unfold, specifically when Russian troops advance deeply into Ukrainian territory and the situation becomes significantly dangerous, for people and stakeholders to focus seriously and agree to enter negotiations. Trump's biggest mistake was trying to start this process before that happened, Mercuri's emphasized. He also argued that the current conflict is evolving in Russia's favor, although most of the international community has yet to acknowledge it. Earlier, The Spectator reported that Ukraine is gradually losing momentum in the peace process aimed at ending hostilities. President Donald Trump had previously stated that the U.S. is discussing core issues related to territorial boundaries and control over nuclear power plants in Ukraine as part of a broader effort to resolve the conflict. Trump's special envoy, Stephen Vukovic, further noted that Washington sees the key issue in the Ukraine conflict as the legal status of the territories annexed by Russia and the potential for international recognition of these areas as part of the Russian Federation.
Russia deploys smoke-generating drones, a new battlefield tactic in Ukraine. In a new effort to enhance the unpredictability of its attacks, Russia is experimenting with using unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, to generate smoke screens, making it harder for Ukrainian forces to detect and respond. A newly released video shows a Russian FPV drone flying over the Jabulia region, releasing a thick smoke screen before launching an attack. This new tactic takes advantage of the speed and maneuverability of UAVs to deploy smoke in specific locations and directions, providing cover for advancing troops or facilitating safe retreats. While smoke has long been used in warfare, particularly during World Wars I and II, the combination with UAVs offers a more flexible and modern approach. According to U.S. military documentation, the use of smoke can create a significant tactical advantage, but also presents risks if not properly controlled. In modern warfare, its effectiveness is often limited due to thermal imaging technologies, which can detect heat signatures through the smoke. On the Ukrainian battlefield, although Russian forces have previously used smoke generators mounted on tanks or unmanned ground vehicles, UGVs, such instances remain relatively rare. Some footage has shown Russian vehicles deploying smoke screens when under UAV attack, but these screens can also make them easier targets. However, integrating smoke systems with FPV drones allows Russia to improve its tactical flexibility. These drones can adjust to wind direction, activate smoke at precise moments, and maintain a stable cover, something difficult to achieve with traditional equipment. Despite this, analysts believe the tactic is unlikely to significantly change the outcome of the war in Ukraine, where overhead surveillance drones are widely used. Nonetheless, it showcases Russia's creativity in applying unconventional UAV tactics. The development of drones equipped with tear gas or specialized materials could have a greater impact in the future. While smoke-generating UAVs may not be a strategic game-changer yet, such experiments are opening up new possibilities for modern warfare.
The U.S. may concede to Russia's demands to end the conflict with Ukraine. According to interviews with senior officials and previously unpublished documents accessed by KB News, the United States is gradually moving toward accepting Russia's key demands to end the conflict in Ukraine. Washington may support the Kremlin's four-point peace plan, weaken Kiev's position, and push for a global campaign to replace Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The documents indicate that Washington is increasingly receptive to Moscow's stance on the origins of the conflict, which emphasizes NATO expansion and alleged discrimination against Russian speakers in Ukraine. According to multiple sources, Moscow is growing confident that the U.S. is willing to meet most of Russia's demands, including making Zelensky's replacement a prerequisite for any peace negotiations. The apparent shift in the U.S. stance is believed to stem from direct negotiations between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, as well as ongoing peace talks in Saudi Arabia. The warming bilateral relationship between Washington and Moscow has encouraged the Kremlin to put forward a series of non-negotiable demands, which Russia hopes will serve as the foundation for any peace agreement. According to sources within the Ukrainian diplomatic and intelligence community, the U.S. may be open to conceding at least 4 key points in Moscow's plan. Ending Western military support, Russia demands that the U.S. and its allies halt all arms transfers, intelligence sharing, and military training for Ukrainian forces. It remains unclear whether this demand applies solely to U.S. aid or includes European assistance as well, recognizing Russian-controlled territories. Moscow seeks international recognition of Crimea, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk as part of Russian territory. These regions were annexed by Russia following controversial referendums. Restoring Russian cultural and religious influence in Ukraine. Russia demands that Ukraine reintegrate the Russian language, Russian media, and the Russian Orthodox Church into daily life, reversing post-2014 policies aimed at reducing Moscow's influence. Returning to the terms of the Istanbul Agreement, Russia wants Ukraine to adhere to the commitments outlined in the peace agreement negotiated in March 2022, which included Ukrainian neutrality, security guarantees, and military limitations in exchange for a Russian troop withdrawal. Experts warn that reverting to the Istanbul Agreement could compromise Ukraine's security and sovereignty. However, it remains uncertain how far Washington is willing to go in making concessions to Moscow, or how Kyiv will respond to these developments. The U.S. leads global arms exports. Ukraine becomes the largest importer. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SEPRI, has released a study showing that U.S. arms exports increased by more than 20% in the 2020 to 2024 period compared to the previous 5 years, accounting for 43% of total global arms exports. This figure is significantly higher than the 35% average over the past 2 decades, highlighting the notable growth of the U.S. defense industry. The U.S. dominates arms export market. According to SIPRI, the U.S. holds an arms export market share 4 times larger than France, the second largest arms exporter. During the same period, U.S. arms exports to European countries rose by 155%, largely due to the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine has become the world's largest arms importer, with its imports increasing nearly 100 times compared to the 2015 to 2019 period. SIPRI reports that 35 countries supplied arms to Ukraine from 2020 to 2024, with the U.S. accounting for 45% of total deliveries, followed by Germany, 12%, and Poland, 11%. Military aid and U.S. defense industry gains. The SIPRI report emphasizes that U.S. military aid to Ukraine has significantly benefited American arms manufacturers. Most of the weapons sent to Ukraine were sourced through the Presidential Drawdown Authority, PDA, from U.S. stockpiles, or purchased directly from American defense contractors using federal budget allocations. The rising demand for weapons in Europe has also boosted U.S. arms exports. As European countries deplete their stockpiles to support Ukraine, they need to replenish their reserves, leading to increased imports from the U.S. Experts note that Europe has surpassed the Middle East to become the largest buyer of U.S. arms between 2020 and 2024. Impact of former President Donald Trump's policies. The surge in U.S. arms exports comes amid increasing pressure from former President Donald Trump on Ukraine to end the conflict after more than 3 years of fighting. Trump has repeatedly stated that the U.S. should be reimbursed for its military aid to Ukraine, most of which consists of military equipment. Additionally, Trump has urged NATO allies to raise their defense budgets to 5% of GDP instead of the previous 2% target. U.S. officials have also encouraged European countries to purchase more American weapons to strengthen transatlantic military alliances. Russia's declining arms exports. While U.S. arms exports are rising, Russia has seen a sharp decline in its global arms sales between 2020 and 2024. According to SIPRI, the war in Ukraine has forced Russia to prioritize its own battlefield needs, while Western sanctions have further hampered its weapons production and trade. Russia's 2 biggest arms customers, China and India, have also begun diversifying their sources. India is increasingly purchasing from Western suppliers, while China is focusing on strengthening its domestic defense industry. In a recent move, the U.S. has expanded its military sales to India. Last month, President Joe Biden told Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi that Washington plans to boost arms sales to New Delhi, including the possibility of supplying F-35 fighter jets, one of the most advanced combat aircraft in the U.S. arsenal. Europe seeks to reduce dependence on the U.S. Although the U.S. remains the dominant arms exporter, some European countries are considering developing their own domestic defense capabilities rather than relying on American suppliers, especially in light of Trump's statements regarding NATO relations. SIPRI researchers note that the current trends reflect a broader rearmament movement in Europe to counter potential threats from Russia. European nations have already acquired nearly 500 fighter jets from the U.S. and continue to place new weapons orders, signaling a major military buildup in the region. According to SIPRI, even without accounting for U.S. arms exports to Ukraine and Israel, the U.S. still held a 37% share of global arms exports from 2020 to 2024, reinforcing its position as the world's top defense supplier. Russia may push the U.S. to reconsider the ceasefire agreement with Ukraine. After analyzing collected data, experts from the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, believe that Russia may be attempting to pressure the U.S. into reconsidering the ceasefire agreement with Ukraine. According to Reuters, senior Russian officials have stated that any temporary ceasefire agreement must take into account Moscow's battlefield advantages and address Russia's concerns. Meanwhile, Bloomberg, citing sources familiar with the Kremlin's position, reported that Russian President Vladimir Putin may prolong the time frame for agreeing to a temporary ceasefire to ensure that favorable terms for Moscow are included in the agreement. Another source suggested that Russia might demand the cessation of arms supplies to Ukraine as a condition for agreeing to a temporary ceasefire. However, it remains unclear whether this ban would apply to all international arms supplies to Ukraine or only to specific countries. Reports indicate that if Washington or other countries were to halt military aid to Ukraine during the ceasefire, it would provide significant advantages for Russia. Moscow continues to receive support from some allies, and such a concession could weaken the U.S.'s leverage at the negotiating table while also violating Ukraine's initial ceasefire agreements. Russian media reports suggest that the Kremlin may officially respond positively to the ceasefire proposal, but could also impose unattainable conditions that Ukraine cannot accept. A Russian source stated that Putin aims to exclude Ukraine from the negotiation process, allowing Moscow to negotiate directly with Washington while strengthening Russia's position on the battlefield before entering formal negotiations. According to the source, any ceasefire agreement must align with Russia's interests. Moscow agreeing to a ceasefire while Ukraine continues receiving weapons and financial support from international partners is deemed unacceptable by Russia. ISW experts believe these signals may be intentional and part of Moscow's negotiation strategy, aimed at pressuring the U.S. to reconsider the ceasefire terms with Ukraine. President Putin briefed on pipeline operation in Kursk. During a visit to the command headquarters in Kursk province on March 12th, Russian President Vladimir Putin received a briefing on the military operation in the region and praised the Russian armed forces for their effectiveness. Russia's rapid assault in Kursk, including the pipeline operation, successfully cut off Ukraine's supply routes, leaving Kyiv's forces encircled and in disarray. Russia has recently intensified counterattacks in Kursk, an area that was targeted by Ukrainian forces in August last year. In his report to President Putin, Russian Army Chief of Staff General Valery Gerasimov highlighted the heroic actions of the coordinated attack units, which included volunteer battalions and veteran forces. According to Gerasimov, over 600 troops used a gas pipeline to traverse approximately 15 kilometers, infiltrating Ukrainian defensive positions in a covert raid. Surprise infiltration strategy disrupts Ukrainian defenses. A specially trained unit executed the infiltration by traveling through an abandoned gas pipeline. This pipeline, which previously transported Russian gas to Europe, was shut down by Ukraine on January 1, 2025. General Gerasimov stated that this maneuver caught the enemy off guard, leading to the collapse of their defensive network and facilitating Russia's advance in Kursk. President Putin commended Russian soldiers, including the 11th Air Assault Brigade, the 30th Mechanized Infantry Regiment, and the Akhmat Special Forces Unit, for their bold and efficient execution of the mission. Additionally, over 10 other units and task forces were recognized for their role in reclaiming key territories in Kursk. Operation planned for months, executed with precision. The pipeline operation had been meticulously planned for several months, before being launched in early March. The primary objective was to initiate offensive maneuvers in Ukrainian-controlled areas, forcing Kiev's forces to retreat from strategic positions and withdraw towards Svatove, where Russian troops had already been positioned for an ambush. On March 1st, oxygen tanks were delivered to the operation's staging area. The following day, Russian troops began moving through the pipeline in small groups toward the town of Svatove. The journey, which took several days, required navigating through confined spaces with limited airflow, demanding extreme endurance and skill. Due to oxygen shortages inside the pipeline, technical teams installed temporary ventilation systems and drilled air holes to facilitate movement. Although the pipeline was wide, it was not tall enough for soldiers to stand upright, forcing them to crouch as they moved. Essential supplies such as water and rations were transported via pulley systems, while soldiers wore specialized protective gear to avoid exposure to residual gases. March 8th, attack plunges Ukraine into chaos. After days of covert movement, Russian troops awaited their attack orders. On March 8th, they simultaneously emerged from pre-prepared exits and swiftly seized key positions. Russian units were then dispersed, advancing into Svatova's industrial sector and surrounding settlements. The unexpected operation caught Ukrainian forces off guard. Despite attempts to resist, Ukrainian troops were swiftly overpowered or forced to retreat, leaving behind military equipment. Russian reinforcements, including armored vehicles and artillery, were rapidly deployed to support the operation. Military analyst Eval Kilim stated the Ukrainian forces were completely unprepared. About 30 minutes after the Russian troops emerged, Ukraine began bombarding the pipeline with cluster munitions. However, by then, Russian troops had already secured the area and fortified their positions, causing widespread panic among the enemy ranks. This is not the first time Russia has used pipeline infiltration tactics. A similar operation took place in January 2024, when Russian reconnaissance forces entered Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka, Donetsk, through an abandoned tunnel. Russia strengthens forces near Sumy. Ukraine warns of imminent attack. Russia prepares for a new offensive. Ukraine calls for allied action. Moscow is concentrating a large number of troops near the Sumy region, raising concerns about an imminent attack. On March 15th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated, "We are fully aware of this and will take countermeasures." He emphasized that Western allies need to understand Russian President Vladimir Putin's strategy. What is he planning? What is he preparing for? And what is he deliberately ignoring? According to Zelensky, Russia's troop buildup indicates that Moscow is prolonging the conflict despite diplomatic efforts to achieve peace. The Ukrainian president also dismissed Russia's claim that a ceasefire is too complex, asserting, "In reality, everything can be controlled, and we have thoroughly discussed this with the United States." He accused Russia of intentionally stalling negotiations and stressed that immediately following talks in Riyadh, Moscow continued escalating its military operations. Military analysts suggest that Russia is attempting to push Ukrainian forces out of key defensive positions in western Russia, adding further pressure on Kyiv. In response, U.S. President Donald Trump has warned that thousands of Ukrainian troops are at risk of being completely encircled. Ukraine calls on allies to ensure security through military deployment. Also, on March 15th, President Zelensky urged Western allies to take a clear stance on ensuring Ukraine's security, including deploying military forces within the country. In a speech on social media, he stated, "These forces must be stationed directly in Ukraine. This is not only about ensuring Ukraine's security, but also the security of all of Europe." UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer also announced that the Coalition of the Willing, a group of Western nations, is developing plans to support Ukraine's security on land, sea, and air in the event of a peace agreement with Russia. Following an online meeting with about 25 Western leaders, Starmer emphasized, "We will strengthen Ukraine's defense capabilities and armed forces, while being ready to deploy troops if a peace agreement is reached to ensure comprehensive security." UK reaffirms cooperation with the US in peace assurance plan. Additionally, Prime Minister Starmer stressed that any plans related to a ceasefire with Russia must involve cooperation with the United States. When asked whether he would continue seeking security support from Washington, Starmer reaffirmed, "The U.S. stance remains unchanged." I have made it clear that this must be carried out alongside the U.S. We are in constant communication with Washington every day. Ukraine sets conditions for lifting sanctions. Russia considers measures to ease economic pressure. Ukraine's conditions for lifting sanctions. As efforts to end the ongoing conflict continue, Ukraine has recently outlined conditions for the potential lifting of sanctions imposed on Russia by the West. According to Vlad Vus, Commissioner for Sanctions Policy under Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the resumption of economic cooperation with Russia is only a matter of time, but it must occur under appropriate conditions. In an interview with Politico published on March 17th, Vus emphasized that economic restrictions, embargoes, and bans on Russian energy imports serve a specific purpose: to push Moscow to end its military operations and reach a long-term peace agreement rather than simply imposing punitive measures. He stated, "At present, it is too early to discuss lifting any sanctions. We only want to ensure that Russia takes significant steps in this direction before any discussions on easing sanctions take place." Vus did not rule out the possibility of European countries signing new agreements to purchase Russian oil and gas if and when the war in Ukraine ends. Russia has great potential, particularly in the energy sector, and it would be a mistake not to take advantage of it. However, we hope that Europe will never find itself entirely dependent on Russian energy in any form. Russia considers measures to ease sanctions. In a related development, Reuters reported on March 13th that the Kremlin is asking domestic companies to identify the sanctions that need to be lifted most urgently. This move comes as U.S. President Donald Trump has warned of stricter sanctions if Russia does not engage in negotiations, while also hinting at the possibility of easing restrictions if Moscow agrees to a ceasefire in Ukraine. A source in the Russian industrial sector told Reuters that the Ministry of Industry and Trade is distributing forms for businesses to fill out, asking them to specify which sanctions have had the greatest impact on their operations. According to the source, payment-related issues remain the most significant obstacle. Several businesses have reported rising transaction costs due to the need to use alternative currencies instead of the US dollar, making financial transactions more expensive and complicated. Additionally, 3 other sources highlighted energy-related sanctions, particularly restrictions on Russia's oil tanker fleet. When asked about the specific sanctions that Russia wants to be eased, the Kremlin stated that it considers all sanctions to be illegal and that they should be lifted entirely. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told reporters, "These issues are part of ongoing negotiations, and I want to reiterate that there is no reason to rush into any conclusions." NATO suggests normalizing relations with Russia. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte recently suggested the possibility of normalizing relations with Moscow. In an interview with Bloomberg on March 13th, Rutte stated that it is natural for the conflict to de-escalate step by step for Europe and the US. And similarly, restoring normal relations with Russia should be approached cautiously and with a clear roadmap.